Hear me? Welcome to this afternoon session called Activating the City. I'm Laurence Oaksash, CEO of CityScience. As many of you will know, one of the key barriers to cycling is safety and the perceptions of safety. This session is all about creating safe, attractive, accessible environments for walking and cycling. And we've got a great lineup of expert speakers. David Moores and Ben Coleman from Phil Jones Associates, Will Clarke from SolarEye, Sjors van Duren from Royal Haskoning, and Natalie Ralph from Diva Creative. But most importantly, this is your session. So it's great to have a panel with such knowledge on all the issues around safe and accessible street design. But please make sure that you ask questions in the chat. So I do encourage you to ask those questions because that's going to make the discussion as fruitful as possible as we come to the discussion at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David Moores and Ben Coleman from Phil Jones Associates with the first presentation. So Ben and David, it's over to you.
I think David thinks trying to sort out the microphone, so I'll make a start. Hello, everyone. So David and I are going to talk.
I think I'm in.
Okay, off you go, David. Then.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. First slide, please. Do you have the first slide? Is that visible?
Yeah, it's there, David.
Hello. Okay, today's session, what we're talking about here is green corridors. And we're looking at it both from a strategic level and a detailing level. There's also looking at the concept of urban greening as part of this corridor design. So the session's in 4 parts. They look at the strategic issues and precedents, some UK scenarios, and then finish off by looking quickly at some of the rationale behind planting, the things we need to consider when we're looking at planting. Next slide, please. Okay, principles. Next slide, please. We'll start really with one of the original definitions of greenways and green corridors. I'll just read this out quickly. Greenways are a network of land containing linear elements that are planned, designed, and managed for multiple purposes, including ecology, recreational, cultural, aesthetic, or other purposes, compatible with the concept of sustainable land use. Now, this is very much still very relevant, but I think over the last 10, 20 years, we can look to expand the definition. And this is where we really are looking proactively incorporating active travel corridors and linking various parts of towns and cities, urban areas in all respects. There's also, we want to explore in more detail the concept of the principle that the route is also the destination. This is something very much pursued in Europe. And some of the really established schemes in Europe have actually become destinations in their own right, so people use them in that respect. We're also looking at greater connectivity between green spaces, not just creating green spaces, and also incorporating the whole concept of healthy street principles and low traffic neighbourhoods. So all these things are becoming to integrate with the whole concept of green corridors. Next slide, please. So the key message, incorporating green infrastructure and planting into urban areas to create place and identity, utilising and enhancing existing green spaces for new uses, and contributing to solutions that help mitigate global warming and climate change. Now, a lot of these, some of these, or many of these things can actually conflict when you're looking at a corridor, because by definition, some of these corridors can be quite narrow. And therefore, we really need to assess which set of principles we want to apply to any given corridor. And that obviously is a scaling issue, but it's also to do with the nature and the type of green infrastructure that you're applying to these spaces. Next slide, please. So approach and strategic planning is the next bit we'll look at briefly. Next slide, please. So we're looking at 3 types of three types of ideas around design and integration of green corridors. There's a retrofitting into existing urban spaces, and this is something that's been pursued by all cities, both throughout the UK and in Europe. It's essentially reassigning existing highway spaces and highway areas back to pedestrian-orientated spaces for cyclists, and in so doing, capitalising on the ability to possibly green these spaces. So we're looking at, as I say, highways, carriageway areas, general hard surfaces in urban areas and open public space, buildings in the built form, rail corridors and river corridors. You've got existing green spaces, which again could include river corridors, but it includes existing parks, larger parks, other green spaces, which there are thousands of small green spaces throughout any city that often have a number of species within them that can contribute to the overall biomass of the city. And then obviously you've got the whole idea of pocket parks, generating new pocket parks, or taking small green areas and creating green spaces that are usable, and then linking all these spaces at the same time. The next slide. So opportunities, but also opportunities, the third area around through new development, and this often includes the rural urban fringe, new housing developments, and extending green links from natural or farm landscapes on the outer edges of towns and cities and taking them right into the existing town centres through proactive design and planning policy. So those are the three areas we're going to quickly look at. Next slide, please. So here we're going to look at precedents. Next slide, please. Now we've got a large number of strategies that are being developed and acted on in the UK. If you take London, for example, an environment strategy looks to redress the balance between thoroughfares in terms of public realm and traffic. And it has got grand plans for removing traffic potentially from certain streets in enabling this connection between green spaces, creating linear parks and therefore green corridors. That's part of the Mayor's transport strategy. And this is very much links in with healthy streets approach, low traffic neighbourhoods and so on. Next slide, please. Then we're just here looking at, in Newham, an example of the Greenway. Again, capitalising on existing corridors of green space, edges of parks, river corridors and so on. So this work is actually being undertaken in the UK as we speak and has been. This is quite an ambitious plan for Wild West in central London. I'm not quite sure how feasible this is given the actual nature of the built environment in this part of London, but there's certainly opportunity to link various large parks that we do have in central London and look at reducing traffic in connecting streets. Next slide, please. However, these principles actually have been taken to a more advanced level in parts of Europe, where I think it's fair to say they're probably 10 years ahead of us in some cities, because they've had a more integrated approach to cycling, particularly in Holland and Germany. This scheme here in Hamburg has already established 2 large green rings within and around the centre of the city, 12 landscape axes coming into the city, and these are providing green links by bike and foot. And in Hamburg, they have actually started closing off streets to traffic and undertaking design to actually green them and make them proactively design them as active travel corridors. So this is something that's being done in other European cities. Next slide, please. This is an example, just a quick image here of one of those connecting routes. So, I mean, the establishment of cycle routes through cities is not new, but it's choosing the relevant spaces there to pass through. And obviously safety is an issue, and lighting is a particular issue with lots of green corridors because they contradict some of the ecology and environmental issues we want to maintain. But making these functional spaces throughout the day and throughout the year is one of the design criteria that needs to be considered with routing. Next slide, please. Montreal has some interesting schemes underway, looking at linking existing parks. Some of these corridors are actually really quite long, and they link over considerable distances. Having read about Montreal, they are looking at different planting types along these corridors, depending on the nature of the associated land uses and adjacent land uses. And this feeds into safety issues, the degree and capacity of cyclists using these spaces, the number of cyclists, the number of pedestrians, and that relates to different plant types. So they're actually looking at a range of environments along these corridors, depending on how people access the individual spaces that you find along the corridors. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example of an alleyway, an offshoot that connects into the main green corridor. So they're actually looking at proactive use of lots of pocket spaces as part of the corridor connectivity. Next slide, please. Again, another image showing proactive use of planting to actually create a wider. One of the things is sight lines and sense of safety. This is using a way leave around electrical supply lines to actually create a new corridor. Next slide, please. Natalie, they've had a program here of creating a lot of interconnected networks of greenery across the city. Right, it's very ambitious because it's had to look at really quite dense urban situations, and also in looking at ways of improving air quality and biodiversity as part of that whole greening process. Next slide, please. Barcelona, this is a well-known scheme. We're looking at urban green corridors. They've got some very wide street patterns within Barcelona, which lends itself to actually reclaiming some of these carriageway spaces. But fundamentally, these are difficult green corridors to establish because it's a very urban situation. I'll show you some more examples of this later. Next slide, please. And here's a typical image of some of the things they're actually doing in Barcelona to reclaim carriageway space, redefine some of the streets, and build in linear planting schemes that connect along the entire length of the street. It's quite an ambitious such project. Next slide, please. As I said in the start of the presentation, river corridors are prime locations and underused spaces for generating green corridors. They're also the ability to define new cycle routes and footpaths, often underutilized brownfield sites within existing cityscapes, but they also allow connectivity from one side of the city to another. Freiburg has actually established this in terms of establishing interconnectivity for cyclists by using the river as it runs through the city. Next slide, please. So applying in the principles in the UK, I'll just hand over to Ben and my colleague now to look at some of the things that are going on in the UK that we're involved in.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. So I guess my brief cameo is to talk about how, so I think David's examples are all quite grand in their vision and their application, but for us day to day is talking a bit about how do those ideas translate into street environments, particularly in the UK, and where actually kind of, I guess for us, we get involved in lots of projects, like an example on the right here in Harlow, where the expectation or the focus is very much on active travel and on accommodating walking and cycling and improving streets, but that doesn't necessarily have a landscape dimension to it. And even though the policy kind of context is shifting much more sustainably, and kind of, last year's release of the updated LTN, you've got the LC whip concept that's becoming more normal, low traffic neighborhoods and traffic free streets. These are becoming normal active travel concepts, but not necessarily then rolling over maybe into the landscape elements and the example like David's given. Next slide, please. So what I was briefly going to go through, actually, sorry, and next slide, sorry. Thank you. What I was going to go through very briefly is there's actually a few project examples, I guess, where we're seeing this come to fruition now and trying to rebalance this and bring in the ideas that David's mentioned into active travel practice. So these are just a few project examples where we've got this challenge at the moment. And so East Grinstead kind of chosen these pictures deliberately because they're only a few minutes apart from each other, but they kind of show the stark contrast that somewhere like East Grinstead, a very typical town, has in the UK. We've been appointed there to develop an LC-WIP, so a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. And on the right, you've got an example of an old train line that's been landscaped and incorporated, and is a key feature actually of the active travel network in the town. But then when you get to East Grinstead itself, you get to the image on the left, and you've got a townscape really that's defined by the A22 and the grade separated town. Even though in some aspects it is green to look at, actually in terms of practice and the ideas that David mentioned, this is where we find ourselves really you need a whole shift in mindset in somewhere like East Grinstead to try and achieve those changes. Next slide, please. But I think the opportunities are there in kind of in a positive way, is that increasingly this will be enabled through that policy change and active travel becoming more encompassing of a wider environment and a healthy streets kind of mindset. And this is a project we've got in Farnham, where again on the right you've got a lot of green. Well, Farnham's completely encircled by very plentiful, open and attractive spaces, but the actual town centre, the historic Georgian town centre, is a gyratory, a two-lane gyratory that completely chokes the town centre. And there's a complete design dichotomy really in Farnham, in that actually all the best bits of it are almost impossible to find because you have to navigate the town centre first. And so in kind of fusing these approaches, I think this is where there's the real opportunity, and actually somewhere in Farnham where the assertion historically has been that through traffic is essential to the future of the town, maybe we might be able to change that. Next slide, please. And I think this reiterates this point. This is an aerial shot of Farnham, and just making the point that right in the centre there, you've got the historic road network, and then the route up to the castle at the north of the screen. But then beyond that, it's nice and green and open spaces, but you've got to find it first. Next slide, please. And lastly, this is I think a point that's particularly close to the kind of the work we're doing at PJ, and maybe the biggest opportunity actually is the approach of low traffic neighbourhoods, and something we work a lot on, from like LTN strategies for boroughs and towns, and actually creating that platform for low traffic environments. So I think like David said, unless you kind of have the benefits of a particularly wide streetscape and you can kind of retrofit those streets to be greened, a lot of historic streets are quite constrained and narrow in the scope for greening. And LTNs seem to be what might be creating the groundswell, particularly at a local level, to try and shift that mentality. And these examples on the left is actually the street where I live in South London, where we had a play street last year, but now it's a full-time LTN in Lambeth. And on the right is an example near the Olympic Park, where I quite like the fact they just used a bench to enforce the modal filter rather than being some ugly bollards. They've actually got a social intervention instead. And maybe the next step, the evolution of these is where we begin to bring in the ideas that David will talk about next. So I'll give back to David.
Okay, next slide, please. So just looking, I'm conscious of time. So just looking at planting design principles. Obviously, there's a lot of information around green. The benefits of bringing in planting to urban areas, both through biodiversity and air quality. And with this comes a whole set of design principles we need to consider. Next slide, thank you. Species selection versus landscape character. I mean, clearly, we're trying to create green corridors. We've got to consider the whole issue of designing with time, spatial requirements and functions of the corridor assessed against plant habit and other functions we might want to bring into that corridor around cycling, walking, sense of security and so on. So we've got to have the right plant species in the right place, and also we've got to have the biodiversity capacity or air quality impacts considered. Are they important in any given corridor? Next slide, please. So species selection is really important. Also understanding where you can bring in other elements such as SUTs. Is also identifying where you want to maximize planting for improving air quality. This will dictate your whole species selection, the understory, the shrub layer and the tree planting. all those have to be considered in habitat and ecological terms, and also plant growth terms, rather than any other function, or as part of overall consideration. Next slide, please. So, as I say, plant species selection is important. Also, where you're using existing green spaces, is mapping existing plant types, plant species, and really understanding what species diversity there is. This all leads into an assessment against for establishing native plant mixes and ornamental mixes when you're looking at other criteria around fauna and flora selection. Now, the other real issue with this type of design work is maintenance. So we have to be designing over the long period, 50 years plus, to really establish what plant growth is going to bring to individual corridors. Slide, please. So also in terms of landscape management, this is potentially a huge maintenance issue we are creating. The more green corridors, green spaces we create. So the actual planting design needs to be considered against the percentage mixes of land uses within any given corridor, and also how it impacts and contributes to adjacent land uses. But not straightforward a sense of just planting trees along corridors needs a lot of thought to get the right level of planting and an assessment of that planting as it grows over time. Next slide, please. Existing green spaces. I think there's a huge exercise to be done in terms of mapping existing green spaces, identifying the species within them, and then looking at how spaces are linked through species selection and species growth. So there's the habitat and the ecology of the actual green infrastructure that you're implementing and how that connects other spaces, which is important. Next slide, please. And then retrofitting. Clearly, any urban planting, we've got the whole issue of below ground detailing, and then fundamentally that needs to have a whole new set of design principles, and also maximising plant establishment and again species selection for identifying which plants are going to do well in these areas. Next slide, please.
1 minute, please, David, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's last two slides. So with, I've just got a couple of slides here from Leon in Spain, where they are doing a lot of retrofitting of streets. And it's just things we need to consider, for example, root cell technology, subspace drainage, and then the associated species selection is critical for the success of these schemes. Next slide, please. And again, finally, this is looking at how to utilise existing verge spaces along main routes into towns and cities and actually transforming them in terms of the species diversity within them, and then how that contributes to routes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David and Ben. I love the idea of the route being the destination. So without further ado, going to hand over to Will Clarke at SolarEye. So Will, over to you.
Lovely, thanks, Laurence. Yes, my name's Will Clarke. I represent SolarEye, and we design and produce lighting primarily really for cycle infrastructure and the rural environment. We're based down in the southwest of England near Bristol. And over the next 5 to 10 minutes, I just want to discuss kind of why we light cycle paths, what really options there are for lighting those cycle paths, and then various case studies using alternative methods such as ours. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So firstly, a little bit about us. We initially were part of a company called Lakeside Group, who are distributors of traffic safety products, primarily reflective films for traffic signs and emergency service vehicles. But back in 8-9 years ago at Trafex, a client came to us and saw a reflective road stud and said, could we do something that, that would illuminate rather than reflect? It kind of got one of our guys going a little bit, so we looked into it and really in conjunction with that client produced what is now SolarEye, which is a standalone product and business unit within Lakeside. Next slide, please. So looking at our products, sorry, next slide, please. Oh, thanks. Our headline product is the SolarEye 80, which is the product on the left. In essence, it's a solar ground light with a solar panel on top, an LED and a battery pack. On a full charge, that SolarEye will illuminate for 200 hours. And what we're trying to do is to drag the autumn sun into the winter. We've designed specifically with Northern Europe in mind, and considering the weather conditions we get during the winter and low light levels. That product has since evolved to have a bat hat added to it. I will go on to that into one of the case studies. We've also, the third product then is actually a roof light for portable toilets, so not so much for the cycling fraternity, but then we are also looking at a solar powered bollard at the moment. So next slide then, please. So I think first of all, we need to really look at why we like cycle paths. I mean, we're all aware of the creep from the urban environment into the rural environment. And I think we always need to look at, are we going to light just for lighting's sake? And what are the primary drivers for why we light? So next slide then, please. So I think we're all pretty much aware of why we want to light, but I think it's just worth highlighting them again. One of the main ones for me is really about accessibility and safety. We build cycle paths, but we want people to use them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I can look at a local industrial park near where I live, and the rush hour there is 5 in the morning. That's when the shifts change in the major factories there. And on that basis, for pretty much half the year, if you want to encourage cycling, any path that leads in or out of that complex is going to need some form of lighting. That leads to giving safety, because you need to be able to see where you're going on that path. We all know about obstacles or things that can jump out or anything like that. So lighting really is quite an important part as we start to plan these kind of routes. There is also the security element, and also about visual appeal for the paths. Next slide, please. So what really are the options? So we build a cycle path, we decide we want to light it. There are loads and loads of different options that we can look at now, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all or nothing. It can be a mixture between the two. If we go to the next slide, please. The main option that people will always use to light a cycle path will obviously be a street lamp. But for many reasons, that may well not be possible. That could be a cost ground, it could be no nearby electricity supply. Some of that's covered with solar power now, but there could also be an ecological ground for it. And what I'll do is I'll just quote from a document. It's an ILP document that talks about lighting for paths. It's ILP document LPG 23 2020. And it talks about typical street lighting is reserved for urban areas or main settlement areas of high employment or education, core leisure routes, and routes linking to secondary destinations. But consideration needs to be given to cycle tracks that pass through sensitive areas, such as sites of special interest, an area that is a habitat of protected species, rural areas where the dark usage is expected to be low or with low risk, and locations where the installation of street columns is detrimental based on aesthetic grounds. And then regarding ground lighting, it also states it will help users identify the boundary between the cycle track and verge borders. Coloured lights can identify posts, bollards, and other obstacles that may pose a danger to cyclists and pedestrians at night. And I think really where we come at it from a SolarEye point of view, and also regarding bollards, is that sometimes doing nothing, while maybe prudent from an ecological point of view, it is not prudent from a safety or accessibility point of view. And if you need that middle ground, there are other forms of lighting that can be used. Next slide, please. So what I'll just do now is just go through a couple of quick case studies where SolarEye has been used as a real world example. We supply predominantly into the UK and Europe, but we do export worldwide. And I've picked a couple of examples here. So next slide, please. The first one I want to go to is regarding Worcester. And the reason I've chosen this one is it's because it kind of demonstrates how we can evolve a product to suit a specific environment. And this one specifically focuses on the bat hat evolution that we've done. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So in Worcester, there was a cycle path running between the cathedral and the River Severn. There's a colony of lesser horseshoe bats in the cathedral, and they feed over the River Severn, and the current path was lit by bollards. The ecologists felt that this was affecting the feeding patterns of the bats going over the river. So the first instance was to turn the bollards off to create a dark corridor for feeding. What that actually then created was a dark corridor for cyclists and walkers, and it was in an urban environment, but although it was still very important to have this dark corridor. He was aware of various ground lighting options, so came and spoke to us about SolarEye being installed on the site. And if we can go for the next slide, please. So what we then looked at is putting in a SolarEye. However, by its very nature, ground lighting is going to produce an upwards light. Although it's a very minimal amount of upwards light, we wanted to really kind of cap that off. So we developed a product in conjunction with Worcester City Council, where we put a little black disc over the top that then became known as the bat hat. And what that does is shield the upwards light from going into the air, and we're recording less than 1 lux at a meter. And if we go to the next slide, please. What we'll see on this video will play in a minute. It's a difference between the standard product and a bat hat version. So the left-hand picture is the standard SolarEye, and the right hand is the bat hat. At 5 meters, the product will look identical. You're looking to the side of the LED. So from a walking and cycling point of view, is fine. But as you get closer, you'll see that the upwards light spill is stopped. So if you can just play that video then, please, Mark. That was a little bit juddery on my screen, so if it was the same on yours, it is available on our website, but you'll see that there is a side view, that there is no difference on the view of the SolarEye. And if we go to the next slide then, please. This is the site overall, so you'll see that the bat hat versions on there don't affect the overall look of the site, and you can see the bollards that are turned out for those particular areas, and the bright lights in the distance are the bollards that are still turned on for that particular section. Next slide, please. And the last thing with Worcester that really gave us a real world test, the product is IP68 certified. That test, I believe, means it should last for 30 minutes underwater. Well, this site was flooded quite substantially in the spring last year. The picture on the left is in February 2020. It was underwater for about 2 weeks. And then the next picture on the right shows the amount of mud that was left from the River Severn that was there. That obviously needed cleaning off, and basically over the space of a month, the product was completely covered. And if we go to the next slide, this shows a photo that I took in March, and that shows that all products are still working perfectly. Next slide. Right, the next case study I just want to have a quick look at is actually based over in Belgium. We met the province of East Flanders at Velo City in Dublin in 2019 now. And they'd never looked at ground lighting. Historically, all of their paths are done with street lamps, but they had a couple of particular projects that wasn't going to really be a viable option. So if we go to the next slide, please. The 2 projects they had there, one was about a 1.5–2 kilometres worth of pathway through completely open farmland, no near source of power. It was classed as a site of special interest, and they just needed some way of delineating it. It linked 2 relatively busy areas, and you just ended up in this section where there was just no way of seeing where the path was. There was a second scheme we looked at as well with them that was outside of a town called Roundabout. That was in a highly sensitive ecological area. There's a really old path going through a wooded area, and there are some rare salamanders in this area. And this year, in fact, now, so 2 years after we started chatting with them, they're looking to upgrade this path to a cycle superhighway. That path involves 3 metre wide asphalt with street columns. there was no way street columns should be used in this area. So what they've done over the last 18 months is we've installed 40 eyes there, some bat hat, some standard, and also some with a double battery version because of the severe shading. And 18 months in, they've been monitoring that path and have had no detrimental effect from the local salamander group that have been monitoring those. If we go to the next slide, please. The last case study I'm going to skip over very quickly. It was relating to the Greenway in Waterston that we'd done. And it was specifically about how we were going to, or how we've used coloured lights to mark out obstacles. So there are quite a lot of gated obstacles and bollards where we've actually put red SolarEyes either side of it just to highlight that there's an obstruction coming up. Unfortunately, technically, the wrong photos in there. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And the next one as well. So the last thing I just want to go on about is really specifically again for our product and spacing of any sort of ground light. The picture on the left is the Greenway in Newham. I think that was mentioned earlier on actually about a Greenway, and that actually does show street lamps being used in conjunction with SolarEyes. But if you decide to put some sort of ground light in, there is a little bit of guidance from a Sustrans document, technical note 29. That refers to putting in ground lights at a 5 metre spacing, edge spacing in pairs. And that's what that photo in Newham shows. But it also says that the path needs to be maintained. And I think the middle photo is something we can probably all relate to, where a very rural path has significant overgrowth. And if there were any SolarEyes put down the side, or any lighting product put down the side there, it wouldn't charge. The products are maintenance free, but they do need to obviously be seen and kept clear of foliage. People will then generally maybe look at a central spacing, and with a central spacing, bike tyres and foot traffic generally keep those areas clear. So there are options for central and edge spacing of particular ground lights. The other thing to look at is how far apart should they be spaced. Again, the Sustrans document says about 5 metres, but we found, and again, it's more down to, in fact, one of a client in Belgium that uses as a rule of thumb to pass a ground light every 2 seconds. So we kind of use the view that if a path is more cycling than walking and is also very straight, a 10 metre spacing would be quite adequate enough for positioning a light. If the path is more weaving, then maybe 5 metres is more prudent, and especially if it's more walking. But this obviously affects the overall amount of lighting that you're going to put on a scheme, with 100 eyes per kilometre for central spacing at 10 metres and 400 eyes at 5 metre spacing at edge. Next slide, please. And that's me done to chat about solar ground lighting.
Thank you very much, Will. That's really good. I mean, I think that some of the great examples there of some really sensitive lighting design. So without further ado, going to hand over now to Sjors van Duren from Royal Haskoning. Sjors, over to you.
Thank you, Laurence, for the introduction. Hello, I'm Sjors van Duren. I'm working for HaskoningDHV. As you can hear, I'm working for the branch. I'm Dutch. I work in the Netherlands, and I want to talk a little bit about Dutch junctions and roundabouts. We as a company, we work on cycling and on innovations in cycling highways for giving infrastructure, etc. That's Royal HaskoningDHV, a large engineering company. But actually, I want to start off with a little bit of Dutch propaganda, which is pictures of people happily cycling with good weather, always laughing, and it never ever rains. I'm calling this propaganda. Really nice pictures, and to be honest, we are not perfect as well, because back in the 70s we had a lot of problems in traffic safety. Protests came. Those protests were actually from mothers and children which said we need safe infrastructure, we need safety, and we need a change in our car system. And until the 70s, the Netherlands were the same as the UK and other countries, in the sense that with the red line, you see that the bicycle use really dropped all the way to the 70s, and that the bicycle fatalities rose. from the 1975 onwards, we developed policies for clear and safe cycling infrastructure. You can see that the cycling fatalities went down, and the bicycle use actually flattened out and increased a little bit to about 25% model share in 2007. And in the last 10 years, it has been increasing even more. But we do not do this in a perfect world. We live in a country with a lot of congestion and in a country which focuses heavily on investing in our infrastructure. We built some of the best, brightest and biggest motorways in the world. When about 2 years ago, we had an Australian delegation over from Australia, obviously, and they came with a bus from Amsterdam, and they were all amazed because they were traffic and highway engineers at the motorways and how well everything was built and how smooth traffic was flowing. And this saying is that we have to deal with a very car-oriented environment and design our cycling networks around this car-dominated world. And before I start talking about intersections, I want to talk really quickly about network development, because when you want to solve an intersection, you already have a problem because that's where traffic modes meet. And when you develop the network, you can actually remove a lot of the necessities, I'm sorry for English, but the necessities to have these intersections by separating the cycling network from the car network. Very simple example is here from the north of Nijmegen, a town in the east of the Netherlands, where on the red line you see the main road, which looks like this. You can cycle around here, and when you develop a cycle path here, you will encounter large infrastructures, large junctions, and a lot of car traffic, so you need complicated intersections and you need safety measures. You can also choose the green line, which goes through the neighborhood, and it's comprised mainly of quiet ways and very easy to going streets, which provides a more attractive environment, but also reduces the need to develop these difficult junctions. Start off quickly with roundabout design. I know this video is a little bit blurry, but as you can see, we're approaching a roundabout here. The van is stopping, and we, as are in a 90-degree angle to the van, so he can see us clearly. He has space to stop, so other traffic can actually pass by. And as a cyclist, I have the right of way here over car traffic. So this is a cyclist eye point of view. From the top, the design of a Dutch-style roundabout looks like this. This is an example of it. This is the same roundabout, a little bit more detailed. And there are a few intrinsic details here which make this roundabout safe and also allow for priority for cyclists. First is that there's an extra space, about 5 meters, between the cycle path and the road lane. And this is when a cyclist, or when a car driver turns off the roundabout, it has space to stop and then look at the car driver from a 90-degree angle. And as you know, humans are lazy. If they have to look all the way over the shoulder, that's probably too much effort for the motorist. So they won't do that, and then they will just keep on going or won't look as well, and they won't see the cyclist. So reducing the mental stress and activity the car driver has to do, the motorist, by just looking at a 90-degree angle, makes it already more likely that he's going to stop and give priority to the cyclist. Additional feature of this roundabout is the car driver can stop in this 5-meter hole, and the car driver behind him can continue on a roundabout. So the traffic keeps on flowing, reducing the psychological stress the car driver experienced. So this extra space functions double, first for the 90-degree angle, and second, also more psychological, to reduce the stress for the motorist, that they don't queue up or hold up traffic on a roundabout. And if we enter a 20-mile-an-hour zone, we actually include a speed bump within the roundabout to highlight the start of it. The bird's eye view looks a little bit like this. You can see this bus actually taking the right turn, stopping and having a look at the cyclists. And the grayish area in the middle is you can ride over it, but it optically narrows down the roundabout, increasing the curve and reducing speeds. This actually allows for the functioning of the roundabout that traffic can go through. Alongside these principles, the Fenham Roads roundabout in Cambridge was designed and implemented in the UK. And once again, you can see very clearly the extra space. You can see here the car who is waiting for traffic, so he gives car traffic priority. The car which is approaching here, stop, priority for the pedestrians and to the cyclist. And in the next phase, you can stop again and give priority to the car. So also here, the mental load and the activities that the motorist has to do is being reduced. Because of the distance between the cycle path and the pedestrian walkway and the car lane, the task of watching out for pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists is split into two. First, pedestrians and cyclists, and second, the car, which also makes it more likely that the car driver will see pedestrians, will see cyclists, and will see other motorists, and thereby actually increasing the safety of the roundabout. And from a pedestrian point of view, it looks like this. And at night, of course, it needs to be well lit, maybe using a bit of the SolarEye, which we earlier talked about. And one important feature here is as well that the tarmac is in a red color, could also be yellow, green, blue. Actually, I do not really care which color it is, but it really highlights to the motorist, here's a priority crossing, and you can expect cyclists here. That's a roundabout design. This is rush hour in Nijmegen in the pre-COVID time. And you see a protected intersection here at work. And what you see is actually cyclists completely separated from car traffic, at ease, comfortable, not stressed, and protected from the car traffic with a separated signal phase, so they won't have partial conflicts with car traffic. I'm already seeing a question in the chat. Would the design work with roundabouts that have heavy traffic flow, or will queuing on a roundabout be an issue? Well, the design of the one-lane roundabout has a limited traffic capacity. I have to ask my colleagues what the maximum capacity is. If you want to increase capacity, you can do a turbo roundabout design or go to a traffic light design with a protected intersection design like this. It's really dependent on traffic flow and also from which direction peak traffic flow is coming. And it's also dependent on which policy you have as a community, because the previous example of the roundabout, which was shown from the top, there the city has said, we accept that there is a bit of queuing during rush hour because we do not want to have that much motorized traffic in the city center. We want to prioritize cycling traffic. So the council accepts a little bit of queuing at that roundabout. When we talk about protected intersections, there are quite a few principles behind the intersections, and there are a few principal solutions. The first solution is actually the island, which protects the cyclist from turning traffic. So the cyclist, when a cyclist is waiting, there is this island which motorists won't cross. We have protected bike lanes leading towards the intersection, and we have a stopping point of cyclists in front of the car traffic, so as you can see here, which means that if a car wants to turn right, stops further back, it has a direct look and view at the cyclist. This only matters actually when there is not a separated signal phasing, because if cyclists have their own green phase, there's obviously no conflict in the intersection itself. On all roads there is an island in the middle, and this traffic island actually allows for crossing in stages if the traffic lights don't work. So, and by crossing in stages, you make it A, easier, you only have to watch from one direction if you cross, and B, make it safer because the crossing distance is a lot shorter. And the design of the intersection is narrow with pretty tight curves and radii to make sure that the speeds of the motorized traffic are low, at least below 50 kilometers an hour. And here the islands also function as a speed limiter, because as you can see, if you want to make a left turn from here, the island forces the motorist actually go a little bit wide and make a tight radii. And here, once again, is a few meters before you hit crossing, the cyclist crossing. And if the cycling crossing has priority when the traffic lights are out, we highlight the cycling crossing with a different color. Same solution actually as we did at the Van Road roundabout. And between the cycle path and the road, there's a waiting space for pedestrians. In the Netherlands, we prefer this because this shortens the crossing distance for a pedestrian over the street towards over the carriageway where motorists and cars go. In Germany and others, they say we actually prefer that the pedestrians wait on the other side of the cycling path, because then you have one phase where you as a pedestrian, especially when you're when you are nearsighted or bad-sided, blind, makes it for them easier to cross because you've got one phase. But the disadvantage of that is that the distance between in the phase from here all the way over there is much longer, and you're less protected by the intersection design. This is something which you can discuss in the design phase. And a third solution, a bit uncommon, but using elements of the protected intersection, is from Groningen. And instead of having phases, you can also, oh, excuse me, this is going wrong. Restart this. Instead of using different phases, you can also say we give all cyclists one phase of green light. And so when the green lights hit, this is in Groningen, all cyclists from all directions get a green light.
1 minute remaining, please.
That's very good because this is my last slide. And the nature of cyclists is going at a steady pace, like 10, 12, 30 miles an hour. People can communicate with each other and negotiate the intersection. And between cyclists, this works really well. And with that presentation, thank you.
Sjors, that's really, really helpful and really interesting. So I'm going to hand over now to Natalie Ralph from Diva Creative, who's going to tell us something about some amazing schemes that they've been running. So very keen to find out more about that.
Thanks, Laurence. So hi, everyone. From Diva Creative. We're an integrated creative agency with a strong focus on delivering active travel and health improvement campaigns. The next slide, please. So it's been fantastic to hear about all the ongoing work in order to implement better and more robust infrastructure, and about creating safer and more accessible environments for walking and cycling. And as we know, the benefits of better active travel options is not only vital for our planet and our air quality, but also the health and well-being of our people too. So today what I wanted to talk about was, once we're implementing these infrastructures, these schemes, how we then move to communicate and actually inspire people to be more active in their environments and see them as accessible, and helping them see the wider benefits of walking and cycling than more than just travel or just exercise, and about framing narrative and language, as that's so important to help people experience their environments differently. Next slide, please. So at Diva, we focus on creative communications to inspire and engage those audiences to help influence those attitudes towards sustainable travel and being more active. Our campaigns have been built to support cycle superhighways such as City Connect in West Yorkshire, or green corridors such as Wildlife Ways in Solihull. And we've helped to build awareness and create positive attitudes towards these local changes, as well as wider communications for a range of other initiatives to promote cycling and walking up and down the country. But today, the campaign that I wanted to talk you through is for GM Walking the Greater Manchester Way. Next slide, please. So following investment into Greater Manchester around the widespread infrastructure that I'm sure most of you know about, as well as a focus on supporting the localities, GM Walking as an organisation was created to help build a social movement for walking itself in order to help improve the overall health and well-being of their residents whilst reducing healthcare costs caused by physical inactivity. And their ultimate ambition is to become the UK's first walking city region. But to help them to get there, they needed a creative campaign that really helped to frame walking as ambitious without being out of reach for the most inactive and the most reluctant to adapt from normal kind of travel behaviours. And that's what our campaign really sought to do. We tried to draw on this pioneering spirit of Greater Manchester with a real focus on its culture, its community, its places, and most importantly, its people. Next slide, please. Okay, based on insight here, there was a real clear recognition of the benefits of walking for travel and physical health. A lot of inactive people either know or assume that they weren't doing enough physical activity, saying that they wanted to do more, but framing it as exercise is what really put people off, and they felt like they didn't have the energy or wasn't fit enough. And we know that walking is one of the most accessible routes into physical activity for those who are inactive. And it's a very good cost-efficient way of getting people to be more active in their travel as well. But how did we encourage that? So we really needed to tap into the idea that walking had a lot more to offer than just exercise or for travel. It wasn't just a means of transport or a way of being physically active. It could actually be so much more than that. And we wanted to help them see how walking could really resonate with people on a personal and a local level to help them feel like they have a sense of ownership over the campaign itself. And ultimately what we were saying to people needed to feel attainable, but also backing that greater ambition in order to strike a real balance, in order to encourage people without making it feel like it was out of their reach. Next slide, please. And so we developed the Greater Manchester Way. So this was a name that not only gave people a sense of place, but also a sense of attitude. It was about how we wanted to do things differently. We were the pioneers, we do things our way, and giving that people a sense of ownership. There were so many different ways to walk in Greater Manchester, but it was really about finding your way and seeing where it takes you. Next slide, please. So to build on this, we aimed to show the real reasons that people walked and the benefits that it brought into their lives. We wanted to demonstrate messages of inclusion and inspiration from all people, not just the ones who were good at it and doing it regularly. And in order to elevate the idea of walking, we wanted to bring a bit of poetry to people's everyday lives and their everyday journeys. And that's why a core part of the Greater Manchester Way was to showcase people's walking stories. Next slide, please. So this was where we could bring the stories of people's positive experiences of walking to life, from the school runs to walks to and from the office, obviously, when we could, to finding people just like them in walking groups. You know, we wanted to demonstrate all the different experiences you could get from popping on a pair of shoes and getting outside. Next slide, please. So we know that authenticity is something that people are increasingly valuing in their campaigns and services, and the power of a good story is something that really connects with people. And many people throughout today have talked about the need for good storytelling within the sessions and the need of sharing stories. So that's exactly what we did. We found walkers from all over Greater Manchester to help, to tell us their stories, and we helped to bring them to life. And we actually used a range of outdoor locations to tell the stories of those people, like John here, who lives in Tameside. And we placed them right in the heart of the communities that the people were actually living and walking, to help give them a sense of experience of the life around them and how they were bringing walking to their lives and others. Next slide, please. So to supplement this out of home, we also created a TV advert and a radio advert, which was filmed across Greater Manchester and was also voiced by Bolton native Maxine Peake. And this was all about creating a positive showcase of all the different people who can engage with walking, encouraging to find their way and see where it takes them. I think we've got the video prepared. Hopefully it'll work. Ooh. I'm getting an error there. Is everybody else seeing that, or is the video playing? Thank you. Okay, so then to supplement the mass media part of the campaign, we also ran targeted social media, which prompted a series of filmed and animated walking stories, bringing the people who spoke to us to life, really focusing for them on health, well-being, connection, travel, and also community, to help inspire people to consider both getting out there for independent walking, whether it's through commuting or travel, or through actual walking groups where they were trying to find more people like them who enjoyed getting out and walking. And the campaign itself was actually due to launch in March, pretty much the week we went into lockdown. So we had to make some very last minute adjustments for COVID, pivoting at the last minute to update messaging. And we eventually launched in August. But when we did launch, as we know that walking was one of the few things that we could actually do throughout lockdown and that really connected people to their outside and their communities, it was actually felt that the content itself felt more relevant than ever. And to further disseminate the messaging, following a rollout to some of the local community groups, we actually developed a toolkit which was handed over to partners, which was developed to help support local amplification of the campaign by the community and the walking groups across GM. Next slide, please. So the first phase of the campaign ran from August to October, and we feel we've seen some really impressive results to date. Next slide, please. So in those months, we have seen over 17 million impressions online and impacts through the out-of-home and TV radio, giving a strong opportunity for campaign awareness and opportunity to engage with people. On our paid social media, there were over 5,000 engagements through comments, shares, or reactions, really demonstrating a willingness of the online community to engage with the discussions. And most importantly, there were over 60,000 clicks through to the website where people could find out more about walking routes in their area or connecting with the walking groups themselves. Next slide, please. And here you'll see just a small selection of comments that were left on our social posts. Across our social media channels, we saw people opening up conversations and discussions between themselves. And there was a real swell of positivity and a real supportive online community who engaged and encouraged others to get involved. And this really supported our objectives of helping to create discussion and sharing of those stories to help bolster the campaign and really make it feel like it was a campaign owned by the people of Greater Manchester. Next slide, please. And we also worked to deliver a first phase campaign of the evaluation with pre and post campaign surveys. Oh, can you might need to press again with the stats coming on. So thank you. Here we saw that amongst those surveyed, a fantastic 1 in 3 people recalled the radio advert and 1 in 10 recalled the TV and out of home, meaning a strong campaign awareness across the region. Next slide, please. And further to this, following seeing our adverts, we saw positive responses to a range of statements related to walking increase across the board. And when asked, people were saying that they walked most days of the week or a few times a week increased as well. We also saw the average number of people, the average number of minutes people walked each week increased by around 5 minutes. And although some of these elements may have been skewed, to walk because of COVID, we know people were trying to get out more and using walking as their daily exercise. And with any campaign evaluation, it is difficult to completely attribute those changes in attitudes and behaviours directly to just the campaign itself. But the level of campaign activity and the vibrancy of the creative mean it's highly likely to have played some part in the changes seen in the survey results. And the second phase of the campaign is due to launch in March this year. So we're going to aim to tie it in with the clocks going forward, obviously giving more people time to get outside, as well as, fingers crossed, some restrictions eventually being eased as well. And we look forward to the results coming in from this. And what we've hoped to show today is how the power of a strong narrative and that storytelling from individuals actually experiencing walking can have a real impact on the way that we communicate and engage with these communities to help other people see the real benefits of active travel and people getting out there and walking, and how important it can be to create a community environment for discussion in particular, and encouragement coming from the ground up rather than necessarily just from the top down. So thank you for listening, and obviously any questions, just give us a shout.
Thank you, Natalie. So thank you, all the speakers. If I could invite the speakers to come back, we're scheduled to be going through to 2:45, so we've got small time for questions. So maybe I could start with Natalie, just to follow on from your presentation. I love that campaign. I love the I'm Not a Cyclist campaign as well. But obviously, there's huge differences between the uptake of different groups for active travel modes. And one of the questions in chat is all around who the main target audience is. So do you know how effective that campaign was with different target groups?
Yeah, so our main target audience is one of those classes is everybody. But then we obviously targeted specifically on social media some of those smaller groups. So we saw quite a big uptake in one of our walking stories, was focused on a mum doing the school run, for example, and we targeted parents of those similar ages. And we saw real uptake and engagement on that one in particular from people of a similar target audience, obviously, having that connection to, trying to get kids in the morning. If people have kids, but obviously it's quite hard to get people out there when the easiest thing is to do it in the car. Whereas actually we saw a real good connection with that. And then one of the other ones was around John, who you saw on the billboard. He was a slightly older gentleman who had a real focus on mental health, and we saw some fantastic engagement from that slightly older audience on social media, connecting with John's story, and other people actually saying how it's inspired them to actually get more active and get out there and walking for themselves. So there are when we get into those specific target audiences, we can see a real connection between the two.
There's a bit of feedback, so I don't know if everyone can mute whilst they're not talking. That'd be really helpful. So just going back all the way to the first presentation, all around the green corridor. So there are lots of questions around the challenges of different surfaces that might get adopted in green corridors. So around, travel practice to work, the surface has to be accessible 365 days a year, and lots of questions raised around tarmac on bridleways. So two questions really for the panel. Firstly, how can we make sure, what surfaces would the panel recommend for those greenways? And secondly, how can we make sure we overcome resistance to more durable surfaces if that's faced? So if I can start with maybe David and Ben. David, you're mute.
Classic mistake. Yeah, very much depends on the volume of, and particularly in rural areas, you've got to be sensitive treatments, and it's the right well to be considered during wet weather, and the type of vegetation you've got at the side of the tracks. So generally speaking, a more method finished important to maintain the use of these cycle tracks, because even under low usage or with some of the kind of loose bound materials, you can get a lot of damage from cycling. So that's a quick answer.
Great. And is there anything from the Dutch experience, Sjors, that you'd like to put?
Yeah, the challenge actually in the Netherlands is the same. As I saw the discussion on the chat as well. There is discussion about the surface, that we shouldn't apply too much surface. So that discussion is really hard to tackle. But what we usually try to apply is either asphalt, tarmac, or concrete. But also really depends on the location, and sometimes whether you choose asphalt, we prefer the red coloring due to traffic safety issues. But I've used also one time a kind of yellow brownish coloring, which made it look like a dirt road. So the surface was sealed, but the color was that of a dirt road, which fitted into the rural countryside environment. And the second was that we used this two stripes of concrete, which matched the width of an old cart, which was drawn by a horse. So you would have like a 50 centimeter wide concrete strip, and then a meter of grass, and another 50 centimeter wide concrete strip. It's definitely not perfect. It's lousy for overtaking, but if there is high opposition, then this could be some kind of intermediate solution which is usable throughout the year. I will stop here because I can continue for.
Okay, one of the other areas of discussion in the chat was all around protests. So I've just taken delivery of Steve Mellier's new book. And I guess in many cases, improving safety for cycling and walking will require reallocation of space and funding away from other modes. What are the ways to get buy-in that might not require protest? So again, Sjors, if you want to start with it.
Having worked with policies and project managers, the first is talk to your traffic engineers. A lot is about traffic flow, motorized traffic flow. And it's really looking at what's your network, what's your system. And sometimes you can actually free up space by having a smarter network for the cars, a better adjustment of traffic lights and all these technical details. So because the throughput capacity of the roads determines the needed width. And we had this 4-lane road in Nijmegen, which used to be 4 lanes with like 8 intersections on the whole length. And by reducing the number of intersections to 3 and having cut off a lot of the side roads, which were just neighborhood streets, we reduced the number of traffic lights and increased the throughput of the road, and we could reduce it back to 2 lanes. So you would have this green wave over about a mile length, and the freed up space was then used to create cycling paths. So it's a little bit technical, but it's working with the other people, the other departments to see what's possible to free up space.
Anyone else want to come in on that question?
I'll just add, Laurence. I think part of the problem maybe is talking about pedestrians and cyclists, to be honest. I think with a lot of our projects, it gets very tribal very quickly when you get into single modes. In our presentation, that's why we included things about, the example of Farnham, where really Farnham, it shouldn't be about walking or cycling. It should be about the fact that it's a beautiful 300-year-old, historic trading village that's grown into a town with a nearly 200-year-old street pattern, trying to accommodate all of that traffic. And like a lot of towns, Farnham's got the complete contradiction of being a huge, most of the town centre is a conservation area, but it's also part of an AQMA. So the air quality is really poor. So the two things are at complete odds with each other, and yet it ends up being about walking and cycling and traffic, when really it should be about the town and what does Farnham want to be, rather than being so modal.
So Will, in the chat, one of the key questions to you was how much is it and where can I get them? So I don't know if you just want to come in on...
Well, I mean, where you can get them tomorrow from me. But as regards cost, it really depends on the specific site, and also the spacing is a clear driver for it. I can give you some rough indications per kilometre is the easiest way of doing it. If you went for the minimum option of really 10-metre central spacing, you're talking £4,000 or £5,000 a kilometre. If you're talking 5 metres edge spacing, you're probably talking £15,000 a kilometre. So significantly cheaper than other forms of lighting. But it's clear to say it's not the same as other forms of lighting. It is on that sliding scale between street lamps and nothing. It's a question of how far you want to go with it.
So, David, how important is lighting for some of those leading schemes you presented in terms of the greenways?
Yeah, it's one of the dilemmas that with some of the greenways, there's an objective behind wildlife. Lighting doesn't often suit. So there's a conflict, and it depends on the actual width of the corridor. I mean, the low-level lighting would help, but what we have found in some green corridors is that the lighting can be detrimental to wildlife. But generally speaking, the more popular cycle routes gap, particularly through green corridors, the more lighting you need to provide because people need to feel safe, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously. Late afternoon, it's dark, and that's supposed to be using these routes if they're commuting. So lighting is important. It's just got to be done sensitively.
In the interest of time, I'll ask one question, final question, go around all of the panelists. So obviously this talk's been all about safety and accessibility and attractiveness, but safety and accessibility go hand in hand. If you could do one thing to think about safety and accessibility holistically, what would it be? What would you prioritize? So maybe we'll start with Will on that one.
I think from our side, it has to be about making everything accessible over the time frame. So that involves lighting and everything else. More and more, we're getting a 24-hour culture. David hinted on the fact that it's dark at 4 in the afternoon. The nights are drawing out now, which is lovely, but before we blink, they'll be drawing in again.
Obviously, from marketing and comms point of view, I think it's just about communicating how accessible and safe those routes are and making people aware that that infrastructure is really in place, either through demonstrating it through stories or people actually out there, or through things like press and PR, just to make sure that people know and give them that really comfort that they're okay to get out there and travel more safely.
Yours?
I would say that to create those safe networks which connect places where people live to places where they want to work, shop, or go to school, and make sure that these networks are safe in general, attractive as a greenway, and that choke points that there are safe designs in terms of roundabouts and intersections, so that Natalie can promote them and make sure that people find them.
I think part of maybe raising awareness of why these accidents are happening. Like we have stats 19 data and information from the police on invariably very trivial reasons why accidents happen. Actually, statistically, sometimes quite funny. But in a way, it's almost letting people know why these things are happening, and to break down the barrier of it just being speed limits and oversimplifying it, making people think a bit more about what they're doing, and obviously, and design comes with that as well.
Finally, David.
Yeah, I think connectivity is really important, and the choice of routes. So particularly green corridors, I think they've got to join up, and I think a good signage strategy is really important. Choices depending on time of day, type of weather, and season as well.
Thank you.
So it needs to be part of the local strategy.
Great. So thank you very much for everyone for listening. Thank you very much for all the panelists. All of the presentations and the video will be available. And with that, we'll end the session here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.